Okay, then let's take a look through the magnifying glass on The Name of the Rose. So this is where my journey begins, and where the journey through the book begins. In the preface of the novel The Name of the Rose, Umberto Eco tells the fictional story of how he found the notes of a monk that formed the basis of the story. But in fact, the book has a second preface, a prologue. This prologue already reflects the words of the first-person narrator and leads directly into the actual plot. Eco uses the second introduction to put a big bracket around the story. The narrator describes witnessing incredible events in his youth as a novice. He gives an outline of the state of the known world at that time and makes a small anticipation of certain plot elements, but remains so vague that it is just enough to arouse the reader's curiosity. Then comes the first chapter, which really gets into the story. In this series, looking at the story through a magnifying glass, I want to use the prologue to tell a brief essay and critique of the novel, the accompanying film and the series. I will avoid revealing too many plot elements, surprises or even solutions. That means, if you don't know the book, film and or series yet, you can follow this report carefree, and if you want, you can get advice from me. I will give my personal opinion. From the next chapter on, I will take a closer look at the plot and which parts were transferred from the novel to the movie and the series, and in what way. Of course, I will discuss all elements of the plot. Well, spoilers, I guess. So, if you would like to take a look at the novel, film or series at the end of the prologue, you should do so before consuming the next episode. Above all, in the later episodes, I will report on the investigative work of the protagonists of the series and what this reveals. In my opinion, reading the novel is worthwhile even if you already know the plot, but there are people who prefer to be surprised. But before we look at the story, let's first look at the man who wrote it all down. Umberto Eco, born on January 5th, 1932 in Alessandria, Piedmont, died on February 19th, 2016 in Milan. An Italian writer, columnist, philosopher, media scientist, and one of the most famous semioticians of the second half of the 20th century. Eco spent his childhood and youth as the son of a lower middle-class family. His father, Giulio Eco, was an accountant in the southern Piedmontese provincial capital Alessandria and its surroundings, which had a strong influence on him. About the city and the landscape, the character and the basic mood of the people living there, as well as everyday life in the 1930s and early 1940s under the regime of Italian fascism, Eco later directly or indirectly spoke in several instances in his novels. In 1948, Eco began, contrary to the wishes of his father, who urged him to pursue a career as a lawyer, to study philosophy and literature history at the University of Turin, which he completed in 1954 with Luigi Paraison, with a dissertation on the aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas. After that, Eco went to the still very young Italian television Rai in Milan, where he tried to set up a cultural program. In 1956 his first book was published, an expanded version of his dissertation entitled Il problema estetico in San Tommaso, the aesthetic problem with St. Thomas. 3 years later, Eco left television and became a non-fiction editor in the Milan publishing house Bompiani, for which he remained working until 1975, and which has since published almost all of his books. With the 1962 book Opera Aperta, he suddenly became known as a brilliant cultural theorist who began his academic career as a lecturer in aesthetics and visual communications at the Polytechnic in Milan. He expanded his academic career via a stopover at the university in Florence to finish at the University of Bologna. In 1975, he received a full professorship in semiotics with a chair at the University of Bologna. Since 1999 he has been head of the Scuola Superiore di Studi Umanistici there. In October 2007 he retired from active teaching, and from 2008 he was Professor Emeritus at the University of Bologna. Eco has received numerous honors and awards, both social and academic. With his first novel, The Name of the Rose, published in 1980, Eco caused a worldwide sensation as a novelist that was completely surprising at the time. His 1988 novel The Foucault Pendulum and the 4 following novels have also been translated into all world languages. The name Umberto Eco is therefore known to a wider audience primarily through these literary works, in which, despite all the joy in colorful storytelling and exciting plots, he makes extensive use of quotations and montage techniques, which has led to their characterization as the postmodern novels par excellence. Eco himself was rather skeptical about the concept of postmodernism and preferred to speak of intertextuality, that is, of the inner interweaving and interweaving of all literary texts with one another. Eco himself takes intertextuality to the extreme by having his book's narrator, Azzo of Melk, say the following: "Up until now, I had always thought that the books only spoke of the human or divine things that are outside of the books. Now it suddenly dawned on me that the books often talk about other books. Yes, sometimes it's as if they were talking to each other. And in the light of this new insight, the library seemed even more sinister to me. Could it have been the sight of a long and secular whisper, an inaudible dialogue between parchment and parchment? So, something living, a room full of powers that no human mind can tame, a treasury full of secrets that have sprung from countless minds and live on after the death of their creators? Or let them persist in the books." And this is intertextual on a meta level, because this is what Umberto Eco has to say about how he approached the writing of the book. "So I sat down and reread the medieval chroniclers to learn the rhythm and innocence of their storytelling. They should speak for me. Then I was free from any suspicion. Of every suspicion, but not of the way of the past, of the echoes of intertextuality. For now I discovered what poets have always known and have said so often. All books always speak of other books, and every story tells a story already told. Homer knew that. Ariosto knew that, not to mention Rabelais and Cervantes. Ergo, my story could only begin with the found manuscript. and it would, of course, only be a quote. So I first wrote the preface, in which I put my tale, wrapped in 3 other tales, in the 4th degree of pupation. I said, that Valet said, that Mabillon said, that Azzo said. Eco first began in March 1978 with no clear idea of the plot. The basic premise was to poison a monk. He writes about this in his postscript to The Name of the Rose. I think novels are born from ideas like this. The rest is fruit pulp that you gradually put on. The main character was initially to be a contemporary monk detective who reads Il Manifesto, an Italian daily newspaper with a left-wing orientation. However, in order not to expose himself in his debut novel, he soon decided to have a medieval monk tell the story, and to give the novel a fictionally historical narrative, beginning with the memories of the youth of the aged Azzon, and ending with his own hasty rough translation of a French book that is no longer available. The working title was at first, as Eco says, The Abbey of Crime, and then, after the main character, Azzo of Milk. However, this second title was rejected by the publisher. The final title refers to the sentence which with the book ends, Stat rosa pristina nomine, nomina nuda tenemus. The rose of yore stands only as a name, we are left only with bare names. It's a variation of a hexameter of Bernard of Cluny's De Contemptu Mundi, of the contempt of the world, where it says about the city of Rome, Stat Roma pristina nomine, nomina nuda tenemus. Ancient Rome only stands as a name, to us only names remain. Eco said of this hidden quote, the name of the rose sends the reader in all directions, not a specific one. If you want, you can also think of the name of the girl. But now that we circled all around it, let's take a look at the plot of The Name of the Rose. The year is 1327. The Pope resides in Avignon at this time and wants to extend his power to worldly lords, while these same worldly lords do not want to have their power curtailed. The monastic order of the Franciscans, who have taken a vow of poverty and who dislike the amassing of wealth and the squeezing of poor peasants by the official church, is drawn into this dispute. A convention is now to take place in a Benedictine abbey in northern Italy. A delegation of Franciscans is to meet with envoys of the Pope to clarify an important question. Did Jesus have a purse? However, this question only covers up a deeper conflict, for which it stands as a representative. Because the real question is, was Jesus poor? And should the church therefore be poor as well? On the way to this abbey, where the meeting is to take place, is the English Franciscan friar William of Baskerville, accompanied by his novice and adlatus Azzo of Milk. They are also the first to arrive, which is not entirely unintentional on the part of William, having heard about the incredible library this monastery houses, which he would have loved to see. But the time seems unfavorable to hold a meeting of such political dimensions in that abbey, because something sinister has happened. After a heavy storm, the monks found one of their own, dead and crushed outside the walls. The body lay below the great tower housing the edificium, the main building, and the library. The weird thing about it, the body lay below a window that cannot be opened. William of Baskerville, known for his sharp mind and having previously worked as an inquisitor, is commissioned by the abbot to shed light on the strange matter. William is disappointed to learn that nobody is allowed to enter the library directly. Nevertheless, he manages to find out through deduction where the unfortunate monk really fell from the walls, which still leaves a mystery unanswered. Did he voluntarily jump to his death? And if so, why? Or was he pushed? And if so, why? Before William can address these questions, events gather momentum. A second monk is found dead in a vat of pig's blood, and a third lies dead in the bathhouse shortly thereafter. Because of the particular situations in which the bodies were found, after a storm with freezing rain, in blood and in water, a few monks draw parallels with a description of the last 7 days of the apocalypse, in which the 7 heavenly trumpets were leading to similar natural disasters, and suspect that the end times have come, or at least that the devil is up to mischief in the abbey. William investigates each new death and comes up with one thing in common. The 2 monks who met their end after the other brother fell from the walls died of poison that leaves a blackened tongue and fingertips. Based on found notes of the 2, it slowly turns out that the deaths are connected to a book that was secretly taken from the library and that is considered so dangerous that someone kills for it. During a nightly search for clues, Azzo meets a girl who was smuggled into the monastery by a monk. He spends a night with that girl in a way that, well, contradicts his vows of celibacy. Events escalate when the papal delegation arrives, accompanied by the Inquisitor Bernard Gui. Gui is described by the history books as effective, meaning he was effective at extracting confessions through torture. The strange things that happen at night in the abbey do not remain hidden from him either. His guards capture 2 monks and the girl, and Gui is willing to learn the truth at all costs so that he can judge. Meanwhile, William still wants to find the real culprit, but to do this, he and Azzo must find a way through the library, which was designed as a maze that strangers get lost. Just as bewildering as the library is the series of murders itself. So this is the plot. Let's first look at the novel. As mentioned, Umberto Eco wrote the story about William, Azzo and the murders in the monastery in the 1970s. The book was first published in 1980 in Eco's native language Italian. Looking at the reviews, the author is often accused of dwelling in long-winded explanation, even comparing it to the style of J.R.R. Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings. In fact, the story has a few peculiarities in this regard, but while Tolkien dwelled on descriptions of landscapes in his work, in Eco it is mostly historical philosophical thoughts or conversations in which 2 views are compared with each other. The whole story is kept in a style of language that seems appropriate to the 14th century. While all of this makes the story lengthy for some, for me it has a special appeal and creates a special atmosphere. What does take some getting used to, however, are the many Latin phrases that are embedded in the text. These are not explained on the spot with a footnote, but you have to go to the appendix at the end of the book. The respective translation can be found there under the corresponding page number. There is also a small glossary where the less common terms of the story are explained. The character of William of Baskerville seems fallen a bit out of time here. Alas, Eco didn't want to write a historically accurate novel, but wanted to convey something completely different with the story. William is a critical, enlightened mind, not content with the simple explanation from others that evil is at work, the devil has done this or that. Not only is he not unlike Sherlock Holmes, Holmes was William's direct inspiration. The dogmatic fanaticism shared not only by the other monks but also by the Inquisitor Bernard Gui ultimately leads to catastrophe. At the same time, Eco also reflects a moral image. For example, when monks who must obey celibacy take advantage of the population's poverty to buy sexual services with food, or when monks feel attracted to one another in a way that, like somebody puts it, is against nature. All these very clever considerations are carried by a crime plot in which the alert mind of William of Baskerville just blinks and flashes. The ending might leave some stumped. Don't worry, the case will be solved, but a few things will still happen. But with this ending, the story fits the time and it's all rounded up. So, if you're not afraid of books with long passages and like to be drawn into a strange world that is not as strange as it seems, and if you also like crime thrillers, you are in good hands with Eco's masterpiece. It also speaks for itself that after the release of The Name of the Rose, the genre of the monk as a detective was revived and we got a few epigones who walked in the footsteps of the famous Franciscan monk. I have to add one more thing. I haven't seen the electronic edition myself, but read some reviews that said that the ebook version is very cumbersome to use. It is probably the case that you cannot click directly on the Latin quotations in the main text to get to the corresponding translation, but you have to go to the appendix manually every time and look for the appropriate passage. Not every reader appreciates that. On the contrary, most find it annoying. And I personally can't comment on that. Now on to the movie, which was released in 1986. It was produced by Bernd Eichinger and directed by Jean-Jacques Annaud. Authors Andrew Birkin, Gérard Brach, Howard Franklin and Alain Godard took on the task of adapting Eco's book into a film. Of course, many things had to be left out, but all these long-going descriptions I mentioned earlier were turned into stunning visuals for this movie. The set builder Dante Ferretti even managed to translate the labyrinth and its way of bewildering the senses into the film by creating not a maze of rooms, but a maze of stairs. Some quotations are indeed taken verbatim from the novel, even if they are sometimes said elsewhere. However, two elements have also been added that contradict the novel somewhat, but which provide more suspense. On the one hand, the animosity between William and Bernard Gouy has deepened, which goes so far as that Gouy accuses William of being responsible for the murders himself. The second element, which I want to leave a bit in the dark here, is something like a ticking clock at the end of the movie. Well, this may be appropriate given that William of Baskerville is portrayed by the actor Sean Connery, who brought James Bond to life for the big screen. And he has to deal with running countdowns more than once. Okay, however, Eco manages to maintain the suspense in the novel without this element. But let's talk about the actors. I already mentioned Sean Connery as William, and he plays the monk very well with all his mannerisms. Christian Slater as Azzo, in one of his first major roles, also fits the part. F. Murray Abraham as Bernard Gouy cranks things up a bit more than the Bernard Gouy in the novel does, where the conflict between him and William is more on the intellectual level. In addition, the fate that befalls Gouy in the film is completely out of thin air. It's not in the novel, since Gouy was a real historical person. In fact, a comparison can be drawn here with another historical figure who was portrayed by Abraham and who was also slightly misrepresented by a film. Antonio Salieri, Mozart's adversary, about whom it is hinted in the film Amadeus that he was filled with envy and somehow to blame for the death of the Austrian composer. Michael Lonsdale as the abbot is a little more dignified than his counterpart in the novel, because there it's an abbot who doesn't really run the abbey, especially not the library. Among other actors, Ron Perlman stands out as Salvatore, who speaks a mishmash of languages and, as a former heretic, knows a few rituals he shouldn't know. As for the other characters, there are a few German-speaking actors among them. Helmut Gwaltinger as Celera Remigius de Varagine, Michael Habeck as Berengar of Arundel, And among the so-called other monks, we find Ludger Pistor, whose film career was just beginning at the time. And if you're asking yourself, who is Ludger Pistor? Then look him up. The best description of how the film The Name of the Rose relates to the novel is given by the film itself in the opening credits. There it is described as a palimpsest of Umberto Eco's novel. A palimpsest is a piece of parchment paper that has been recycled. Since paper was very expensive in those days, parchment that were no longer needed were not simply thrown away. Instead, a sharp blade was used to scrape off the top layer, causing the text written there to disappear. Then the parchment was used again. However, because the ink sometimes penetrated the paper a little deeper, the original text could still be seen shimmering through on the palimpsest sometimes. This description fits very well. Eco's text shimmers through in the film. At the same time, something new and personal and different was made out of the whole thing. Eco himself described the film as an independent, acceptable representation of his work. The ending, for my personal taste, is a little bit too much. I understand that the finale of a story like this has to be improved a bit in a movie, but less would have been more here. Nevertheless, I can recommend the film. It still is my favorite adaptation. Which brings us to the series. The series was commissioned in 2017, so it would be completed in time for the book's 40th anniversary. There are 8 episodes in total, each approximately 50 minutes long. Accordingly, more of the content of the book was implemented, but some drastic changes and additions were made. Azzo of Melk gets a background that partly contradicts the book, and the heretic leader Fra Dolcino, who is mentioned in the book and who was followed some time ago by some monks of the abbey, gets a bigger role. In addition, Anna, Dolcino's daughter, is inserted, who wants to take revenge on Gui for the death of her parents. Anna is fictional for the series only, but that Gui ordered the death of Fra Dolcino and his mate is historical. The role of the girl is expanded, so that Azzo does not meet her in the monastery kitchen by chance, but before that, and gets to know her. The conflict between William and Gui also deepens, although tensions flare up a few times, and then suddenly disappear and lead nowhere. And the end also gets a ticking clock, like the movie. But it's designed a little different than there. Furthermore, the way William and Azzo meet and eventually break up is portrayed in a completely different way than in the book. And I can't figure out what the authors were thinking. Speaking of the writers, the series was written by Giacomo Battiato, Andrea Porporati, Nigel Williams and John Turturro. Turturro also stars. We see Damian Hardung as Azzo of Melk and Rupert Everett as Bernard Gui. The latter doesn't get quite as angry as F. Murray Abraham, but he plays the role permanently peevish, which he shows in a constantly grumpy face. Like in the movie, the sets are also very stunning, and especially the pictures of the opening credits put the viewer in the mood for the series. But I can't recommend this series unreservedly. I see the general ideas behind many of the changes in the story, but too many of the changes didn't do the story any good in my opinion. For example, a subplot is included about the fact that the Pope has a spy in the monastery with whom he communicates via a carrier pigeon, but in a way that is not possible with carrier pigeons. I'm divided about the series. On one hand, it's nice that the authors actually take the time available to enact scenes the way they were written for the book, and the whole story takes advantage of developing slowly. but the additions and sometimes drastic changes don't all fit into the concept. In my opinion, the character of Anna in particular seems out of place, as if a character from a fantasy story had gotten lost in a historical drama, and that's a shame. Perhaps my judgment will soften a bit as I revisit the story, now that I'm about to examine the plot and compare the novel to the movie and the series. I will soon arrive at my destination. Everything has been set for the moment, and therefore here again the warning. From the next episode on, we will look at the plot, and if it comes to that, surprises and important events will also be told and analyzed. If you want to experience the story yourself, read the novel, watch the film, or even the series before the next episode. The play begins. May I set the stage?